It's Tuesday the 29th of September. On Friday the 2nd of October the country is going to be voting on Lisbon. I'm here with Joe Costello. He's the Labour Party spokesperson on European affairs and the Director of Elections for the Lisbon Treaty. I'm putting questions to him that were posed by the members of the Boards.ie political forum. Joe, thank you very much for this. I'm going to ask you, as somebody who doesn't know which way he's going to vote yes, why should I vote yes? Can you put it to me very simply? I realise this is a very, very complicated issue. There has been so much from both sides of the campaign, the yes campaigners of the no campaigners, all bringing in different parts of the treaty. But is there a simple way that you can say, if you vote yes, this is the benefit to the country, or the benefit to me?
Well, the Labour Party was the first party to come out in favour of the Lisbon Treaty, and we did so because we liked the package that's in the Lisbon Treaty. And the package is really about the type of society that's envisaged in the treaty, where the treaty looks for full employment, where it looks for a social market, where it looks for a charter of fundamental rights, where it deals with climate change, with globalisation, with eradication of poverty worldwide, and where also it tweaks the various institutions of the European Union in the direction of accountability and transparency. And finally, where it virtually introduces a new institution, and that is the national parliaments, because now the national parliaments are going to be actually the watchdogs and the safeguards of whatever is going on in the European Union. They will have to be involved now from the very beginning, before any of the other institutions apart from the Commission, and they will be responsible for ensuring that all legislation, all policy is scrutinised in advance. So that's a huge move forward in democracy. So the entire package is good from a Labour point of view. It reflects a lot of the values, a lot of the principles that we stand for. So we're fully in favour of the Lisbon Treaty.
There's been a lot from the no campaign, particularly campaign parties like CORE and whatever, who have said the minimum wage is going to be dropped, there's going to be abortion introduced, euthanasia introduced and whatever. Would you feel that the Labour is running a very honest campaign?
Yeah, I think that what has been happening from the no side is that they've been introducing totally misleading, not just misleading, but falsehoods. They're lies. I mean, the minimum wage, everybody knows, can't be changed except by the national government. European Union has no say, good, bad or indifferent. Everybody should know as well that the issue of abortion has been dealt with, and has been dealt with very strongly. It was dealt with on previous occasions when it was an issue that came up in previous treaties, and once again there's an absolute legal assurance in relation to abortion, in relation to education, in relation to the family, in relation to taxation, in relation to neutrality. There has been guarantees received on all of those, and these are guarantees between sovereign states. Now, people would say that the guarantees are worthless. We've heard that said from the no side, but that is not true. They're exactly the same guarantees as the British and Irish government gave in relation to the Good Friday Agreement. They are international treaties because they've been lodged with the United Nations by sovereign states, and nobody thinks that the Good Friday Agreement is going to be shredded. So for anybody to describe the guarantees that we have received from 26 other states in Europe as worthless is just plainly false and misleading.
But the simple fact is, we voted no the last time. So here we are again now. You'll have to excuse the names here. Moondog Spot on Boards pointed out that Eamon Gilmore said after the last vote, I don't think there's any question of this treaty being put a second time to the people, or I think the Lisbon Treaty is dead. What made the Labour Party decide to, okay, we will go and campaign on this again?
Yeah, well, Eamon certainly did say that particular treaty, that was the end of that.
But nothing's changed, as far as I understand it.
Well, a lot of things have changed. Now, what has changed, there's been a lot of substantial developments. For example, when we were discussing it the last time, we didn't have a commissioner for every country. Now, that is colossal, because Declan Ganley and Sinn Féin, they were the trust of their campaigns. They wanted a commissioner. How could we vote for this without a commissioner? Now we have a commissioner, but not only do we have a commissioner, we can't have the commissioner unless the Lisbon Treaty is ratified. We can't have the commissioner. We couldn't have the commissioner under Nice. So it's extremely important that we recognise that. Secondly, all the guarantees are legally binding guarantees, and these these were the issues that were identified in relation to concerns that people had expressed in the course of the last treaty. So what we're doing is we're putting a different set of proposals to the people. It's the same text in the treaty, but there is a different set of proposals, many of whom will be appended to the next treaty in terms of protocols and will become treaty. They'll have the status of treaty when the next treaty comes out. But in the meantime, they are legally binding international agreements between sovereign states, and that's very important. So we have a different set of proposition here for people to vote on than we had the last time.
Thank you. Kick out the jobs right now. Is there any truth to the claims that a yes vote will increase liberalisation of state services?
No, not at all. It's clearly stated. In fact, there's a lot of good things in this particular treaty in relation to the public services. First of all, there's a clarification of public services that are public services through payment, what are called general economic public services, like Dublin Bus, where you have to pay partly for it, and then other public services which are purely the domain of the remit of the state, like education and health. And it allows for that distinction to be clearly made, and it states that all of the public services that the state has responsibility for in terms of health and education, that these now can have a legal base so that they can be clarified once and for all. So there is a section on that, section 14 in the treaty. There's also a protocol in relation to public services which extends the terms in the previous treaty and which makes it quite clear that the member states are fully responsible for the delivery of public services that are not of an economic nature. Now, that's extremely important, that there is no interference by the European Union. For anybody then to say that the European Union is going to privatise our health and education system, the only people who can privatise our health and education system are our own governments. And unfortunately, they've been doing a bit of that. Mary Harney has been attempting to privatise our hospital system. We saw where the government sold off Aer Lingus. That shouldn't have been done, but the European Union had no say, good, bad or indifferent in any of that.
Okay.
And the Lisbon Treaty will copper fasten that and make it much, much stronger in terms of the inability for any privatisation to take place.
Given how often the Laval and Vaxholm cases are brought up, what are Labour's opinions on the rulings, and do they feel that the Labour Treaty will change such outcomes in any way?
Yes, I suppose the first thing to remember is that all of the European Court of Justice cases in Ireland have found in favour of the citizens and in favour of the workers. They've found against our government for breaches of directives, they've found against the government in relation to fixed term workers, and the government has had to make compensation in a number of cases. So we're talking about cases that came up in other countries. Now, the case that came up in the other countries couldn't take place in Ireland simply because we have transposed the Posting of Workers Directive, and 3 of the 4 cases we mentioned, all the cases except the Viking case, that's the Laval case, the Ruford case, the Luxembourg case, all of these are related to the Posting of Workers Directive. And I went over to Sweden in the summer to meet the trade union movement, the Trade Union Congress, and to meet the employers, and found out exactly what did happen. And what actually happened in Sweden was this, that they have a very sophisticated way of dealing the social partnership between the business sector and between the trade union movement, but it's a bilateral agreement, and a third party coming in, which was what happened in that case, coming in the Posting of Workers Directive, is not bound by a bilateral agreement. So they recognised that they had introduced the Posting of Workers inadequately, so therefore it was their mistake, and now they have rectified the matter and they have introduced legislation so that this can't happen again. But they will openly admit that it was a mistake on their part for not having properly transposed the legislation, and they have categorically said to us when we went over there, says, tell the Irish people that we are 100% in favour of the Lisbon Treaty.
Okay. Armani Jeans would like to know, bearing in mind the misinformation and dirty tricks, in his opinion, that have been put out by the no side, does he think that the referenda are? Do you think that the referenda are a good idea, or would a method of ratification similar to the other members of the EU be better?
Well, that's one that's certainly going to be debated for a while. Personally, I'm in favour of a referendum. I love the idea of people having the opportunity of voting on things. I think it's great, and the more the merrier. Now, what it does mean is that we have to make sure that when important issues come down the track, because don't forget, this is a referendum, this is changing our constitution, that we have mechanisms and proper mechanisms in place so that the maximum amount of information is out there for the public to see, the maximum amount of awareness is there, that there's adequate time put in place, and that we have civic society deeply involved in the referenda. Otherwise, we will find that there can be misinformation, that a wealthy guy with deep pockets can buy an awful lot of publicity, and who may be working from an ulterior agenda. So we have to be careful. We're a small country, only 4 million, 2 million voters, and it's very important that we protect our democracy jealously, but that we take precautions to ensure that it's not abused. So I would be in favour of referenda, but I'd like to make sure that nobody is able to abuse it.
Do you think it will ever be possible for an EU referendum to pass first time in Ireland again?
I should hope so. I think it will. I think that we have to take up a different approach to referenda, as I said, and that we must treat referenda as an election. If we do that, and if we get out there and knock on doors and ask people and meet and greet them, ask them for their vote, assure them and reassure them where there's some doubts there, where there's scaremongering, I don't see a problem.
Blitzkrieg would like to know, where does Labour and the PES hope that Lisbon will take the European Union, and does the recent uptake in right-wing MEPs and governments not give them cause to worry that they might take Lisbon in the wrong direction?
Well, I think if we don't have Lisbon, I think there's a greater danger of the European Union going in the wrong direction, because we'd be operating under the least dispensation. And remember that if another treaty does come down the tracks with a number of neoliberal governments in place at the present time, the likelihood is that it won't have the social dimension which the Lisbon Treaty has. And the Lisbon Treaty has an enormous social dimension, absolute commitment to the social market agenda, social proofing of all legislation from the European Union for the future, which is incredibly important, because it means that the marketplace cannot ride roughshod in the future. It must take into account the impact on communities, on employment, on all things of that nature. So we have a good treaty there that is very socially directed and prescriptive in that respect. And I think that the Lisbon Treaty will be very beneficial in moving forward, even though there are at the present time a majority of centre-right governments there, and I think that the PES, whom we are affiliated to, will be working to ensure that the contents and the substance of the Lisbon Treaty is implemented and adhered to. And also the European Court of Justice, that we've heard so much about, will be interpreting the Lisbon Treaty, and will be interpreting all the treaties with the Lisbon Treaty as part of it, and with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. The interpretation, to my mind, is going to be beneficial.
Okay. Kieran Allen recently stated that SIP2 support of Lisbon was not consultant with its members, and that Labour prompted this as a commitment to legislate on collective bargaining if they were in government. What is Labour's position on those statements?
Well, SIP2 conducts its business in the manner that's appropriate to it, and it did, and it published a document of the reasons why it decided on this occasion to recommend a yes vote. And it did so, and it said categorically that they had been looking for 100 years now, since the foundation of SIP2, which is celebrating its centenary this year, for collective bargaining. Right? The Labour Party has made a categorical commitment to that. The Charter of Fundamental Rights contains a provision for collective bargaining, and so I cannot understand how anybody is against the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, when actually what SIP2 have always been looking for is contained there. So the Labour Party has said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to legislate to ensure that that commitment in the Charter is transposed into Irish law. So that's it. And Fine Gael has come in now and said that they're going to do the same. So the main objective that SIP2 have been denied for 100 years is now within the treaty. So I don't see what Kieran Allen is talking about.
A question kind of leaning on from that, from Super Furry. In what way will the Lisbon Treaty most impact the Irish worker?
Well, what it will do is, and I've referred to this before, is that there's quite the theme running through the Lisbon Treaty is about transparency, democracy, accountability, and secondly, about the social agenda. So all of that has to be beneficial for the Irish worker. And once you put the Charter of Fundamental Rights into primary legislation, that would mean that decisions that came about in the past will be very difficult for the European Court of Justice, because the European Court of Justice must interpret according to the law. So now the Charter will be the law. It hasn't been the law before. So my view is that workers will do well out of the Lisbon Treaty, and that's very much the reason that we supported the Charter, the social clause. And remember, what the social clause means in this is that every piece of legislation that comes out of Europe has going to be socially proved in terms of its impact, and that can only be good for workers, for citizens, for men and women. And the commitments to egalitarianism, to the rights of the child, to non-discrimination, to social exclusion, all of these things are literally running through the treaty at all stages. So something like that is something we should not say no to.
Manerman Earl would like to know, how do you feel about the poster campaigns from both sides, and would you agree that a certain amount of scaremongering by parties has taken place in the run-up to this referendum?
Well, the minimum wage is one example.
Yes.
That's clearly a lie.
Spoke about that, yes.
That's clearly a lie, and it's a very powerful poster, but nevertheless it's clearly a lie. It's always easier to put up posters that simplify things and that are misleading, because they will, if they're directed to scare people, and that's what that's directed to. But there's equal posters coming up from Joe Higgins, like the Lisbon Treaty slashes your rights, which is a total lie. It doesn't. There is absolutely nothing in the Lisbon Treaty that denies or reduces any entitlement that a citizen of this country or the European Union has. Absolutely not. So I'm worried about that type of approach to it, and I would have liked to see some examination by, the Standards in Public Office or by the Referenda Commission into the content of some of the posters that are up there, because they're clearly intended to scaremonger.
I know we're running out of time here, so I am going to ask just a couple of more questions. I'll just read this one verbatim. Do you fear that the spectre of a West Brit right-wing, painfully religious charlatan spending millions of West Point dollars attempting to push a specific but unknown agenda purely on the basis that Lisbon is a point of leverage that can only be exploited via manipulating the minds of the voting populace of ERA?
That's a terrible way to describe Declan Ganley.
That's wow.
Yeah, but it's a terrible way to describe him, but it's very accurate. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very dangerous that somebody could undermine our constitution with either foreign money or with their own money, that a wealthy business person with a very questionable agenda, with his funding has come from very suspicious circumstances, who has refused point blank to comply with the standards in public office. Mm-hmm. Even they wrote to him, they communicated with him, they emailed him on a number of occasions. He has not provided the information in relation which statutorily he's obliged to do. Unfortunately, there are no sanctions, and I have asked the Taoiseach to introduce sanctions for somebody who refuses to divulge the source of their funding, because you could thwart the Constitution because of an agenda that could be coming from a subversive area. And I'd be very worried about somebody of that nature coming in out of the blue, coming from nowhere, spending a fortune and trying to get a particular result.
We're on our last two questions. This from Project Mayhem. If a yes vote happens, and he is a yes voter, what's stopping big companies that Ireland has relied on for employment, particularly in the IT sector, simply going to the cheaper countries in Eastern Europe like Poland and Slovakia?
Well, if a no vote comes, okay, you can bet your life that that's where they're likely to go. You can imagine if you were in charge of a multi-billion international company, and you were looking at what Ireland had done now, and if Ireland was to vote for a second time a no to the Lisbon Treaty, it's very likely that you would make the interpretation that Ireland is not fully involved with Europe and doesn't want to be fully involved with Europe. And if the main reason that your company has been investing in Ireland is because it's a stepping stone to the European market. You think twice in the long term before introducing further investment, further capital, further plant, and then you might very well look abroad to some country that's more directly and more centrally involved in Europe. So that's a real danger, and there's 300,000 Irish people employed directly or indirectly in foreign direct investment in this country, and 80% of our exports coming from foreign direct investment, and they go to the European market. So I really believe that there are consequences for voting no, and to vote yes is certainly a more beneficial way to go at this point in time.
This might be a very big question to end on, but where does Labour see Europe going in the next 10 to 20 years' time in a Lisbon ratified sense versus a non-ratified sense for Ireland?
Well, I think that there's a huge difference. If we don't have Lisbon, first of all, we're going to have a European Union that isn't streamlined, that's going to find it hard to make decisions, that its institutions were put together when there were 6 countries, now there's 27 countries, and it's going to be very hard to get decisions made. Secondly, we will find a Lisbon that hasn't got that social thread running through all its legislation and all its policies. And at the present time, we have centre-right governments in place in most of the European countries. So that would be a setback for the social agenda that we espouse. If Lisbon is passed, then Lisbon will be streamlined in terms of its effectiveness in dealing with the issues, and there's a lot of local issues, but there's a lot of global issues. Don't forget there's a lot of those big issues out there, climate change, world poverty, humanitarian aid, that are facing us, that we can only deal with in a larger entity. We cannot deal with them that well ourselves. And then Ireland itself needs Europe, because we were dependent on Britain before, and our markets were very limited because Britain always paid lower rates for Irish goods. Now we have got our independence, our economic independence from Britain. Let's hold on to that. Diversified market, bigger market, better prices for our goods, and that's why a lot of the people are coming to this country to invest. A lot of people are coming to work in this country. That's where our progress has been made since 1973. That's the way forward, and I believe firmly that Lisbon is good for Ireland and that the European Union is good for Ireland, and we're good for the European Union too.
If we vote no, are we going to go again?
No.
No. Okay, great. Joe, thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Darragh.